Hi YouTubers, welcome to another episode of All Things DIY. Now today I'm focusing on the Cox Lawnboss ride-on lawnmower, particularly the spindle and belt replacement. So if your cutting deck on your Lawnboss or on your ride-on mower for that matter becomes noisy, there's normally a couple good reasons for that. Probably your bearing is shot. But these things don't last forever. So what happens is, if you look at this is the cutting deck, this is the pulley on the spindle. Now, there's a belt which runs, in the case of the Cox Lawnboss, from the back pulley under the seat to this pulley here. And as this turns, it turns your cutting disc with the blades on it, this guy here. So that actually bolts onto the bottom of the spindle. So that one actually, this is the old spindle here, actually fits like that. So I haven't got as far as putting that back on just yet. I thought I'd make a video first because it would have been helpful when I was doing this to see someone else's video. There wasn't one. So if you notice strange noises, particularly dry bearing sound, then chances are good you need to replace your spindle and the pulley, and you need to check your belt as well. So how do you get this all apart? Well, it's beneath the actual ride-on itself. When you look under the cutting deck, when you drop the deck using the lever, when you cut the deck, lower the deck, sounds like you're playing cards. When you lower the deck, you'll see it look a bit like this. This is actually a brake which rests against the pulley when the blades are released, and when you engage the blades, it should actually come out of the way. You've got to make sure that's not dragging on your pulley, or else you're going to lose power. So the actual cutting deck has this brake arm here. You can take that off. It has a little axle here. There's a little lock nut you got to loosen here, and you got to retract this axle. That's from the front. Retract that. On the back, there's actually a little arm that's shaped like that. It's a bit like this kind of concept. And there's a little split pin here. You just pull that out, and then the back will come down. You can pull the pin out, and then it's actually free. So you don't have to take the blades off before you do that. This whole thing can come as one entire unit. Right, so once you've pulled the pin, release the back, pull the pin, remove this brake arm, the cutting deck will there's a spring as well. One spring here. Once you release the spring, you can actually drop this entire cutting deck, onto the floor, pull it out, and ideally put it up somewhere where you can actually work on it. Now, to actually remove this guy, you're going to have to loosen this top nut. So you can either use an impact wrench, which I did, just and off she comes, or else you can actually tie something to the cutting disc itself, to the body here, and then use that to stop the spindles from spinning. So the impact wrench is far easier. Or a rattle gun, if you got one, done. So once you take the pulley off, then there's actually a collar which you can't see. It's actually underneath here. It's about a 3/4 of an inch high collar which sits here. You pull that off. Then all you need to do, if you want your spindle to last, gently put a block of wood or something and tap, 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 tap. The spindle actually comes out like this with this bottom bearing already attached. So don't worry about trying to remove this guy. So it drops out the bottom. And then once you've done that, you can knock out the bearing. I've actually given you the number here. There's a bearing which actually fits in the top of the spindle housing, so it's actually in there. You can just knock that with a punch out from the inside. So always replace this bearing. So when you buy a new spindle, and if there's any imperfections on the old one, get rid of it, throw it away. This one was totally shagged. It's actually a little bit buckled and bent, and when I turned the pulley, you could actually see the pulley was actually moving a little bit like this. But there's a key which actually locks these pulleys in place on this shaft, and that key was absolutely mangled. It looked like it actually been twisted. So if there's any imperfections, chuck it away. Do not keep it. Yeah. So it's actually a fairly simple process removing it, and don't worry about this one unless you want to reuse the same spindle. I tried using a bearing puller on mine to get this one off, or a gear puller. It wasn't happening. But when I actually looked at it, I thought, okay, no point in wasting my time trying to pull this bearing off, although you can, I'm sure. Just when you buy the new one, it comes with the bearing attached. So once you've got that out, once you've knocked out the old bearing in this housing here, put the new bearing in from the top. You can actually put your bearing in the freezer and just heat up your spindle housing with a heat gun. But don't heat up the bearings because there's actually grease inside these. If you cook them, the grease will come flying out. It'll be dry inside there. So don't do anything except put this in the fridge if you want to. Yeah. So once you've got the bearing in this housing here, and you've got your new spindle with this bearing attached, this has to actually come in from the underneath through the bearing. Now the problem is, so I did this upside down, the problem is it keeps knocking the bearing out of the housing here. So I eventually made this. It's a piece of plywood which I used a wood borer on. I always forget the name of these things, but they make these holes in the wood. Anyway, so this is a 19mm hole. Is it a hole saw? I think it's a hole saw. 19mm. So I cut a 19mm hole, which is just 1mm wider than the actual spindle shaft itself. I think it's 18mm. So I put two pieces of plywood together, and I actually used the hole saw and made this hole, and turned the entire apparatus upside down. So the pulley wasn't on there, obviously, at that time. Turned it upside down on the concrete floor. I got my wife to hold the actual cutting deck straight, and I lined it up so I could see that the spindle would actually go into the hole like that, without ejecting this bearing in the meantime. So that actually worked well. I used a 4-pound hammer. I put a bit of wood on top first, and I tonked this guy. Tonk, gently, tonk, straight, and it actually fitted it nicely. So yeah, I actually recommend you try that option, unless you have some kind of fancy press or something more advanced than I have. Yeah, so that actually worked well. Now, there is a torque setting for the spindle nut. So the old one used to use a washer and a nut on top. The new one actually uses a bolt. So they've got a central threaded hole. So the new one uses a bolt. The torque setting is about 52 Newton meters. But like I say, it's going to spin. When you try and tighten this, it's going to turn and turn. You have to somehow, I think I'm going to put the cutting disc back on. Put a piece of wire or something on there so it binds, and I'll just get my torque wrench and click her up. And you're supposed to use a medium thread locking compound as well, but I'm not sure if I'll bother with that. Yeah, so looking at the basic costs, spindle 150, whoops, the pulley was about 75, but just bear in mind if your key got mangled and the whole internal part of this pulley looks really off-centered, throw it away. That pulley was about 75. And the bearing, this guy here, about 10 bucks. And the key, which looks vaguely like that actually, looks like a little rectangular prism, that was 6 bucks. The belts, I haven't actually mentioned those yet. There are 2 belts on the Lawnboss. One which goes, this is the upper belt is the long one. It runs from the engine to the drive system. And the lower one runs from the back drive system to the actual pulley. Yeah. So they actually run a bit like that and like that. Yeah, you get the idea. Like that and like that. And bear in mind the long one's on top and the low one's like a bit like that. Yeah, that's it. So why am I replacing these belts? Well, if you go to the trouble of taking this lot off, you might as well. But odd enough, when you actually check your belts, look at that. There's a proper crack there. This belt looks perfect, except when you actually start checking it like that. And wow, that was actually half gone already. The belts, I think, were about 40 bucks a piece. I can't quite remember them now, but yeah. So when you replace the belts, it's not actually a difficult process. But at the back, this is the actual drive pulley. So the long pulley goes from the engine to this upper pulley, and the short belt goes from this pulley to that cutting deck pulley. And it's sort of in sort of that position, relatively speaking, to it. Yeah, so there's 4 bolts. You don't have to loosen the central one. You just loosen the right pair and the left pair. You can actually wiggle this component out the back. It's under your seat. Yeah, and then you can put the belts in and then put this back in, bolt it back in, and Bob's your uncle. Well, I hope this video has been helpful to you, and I wish you well with your spindle and belt replacement. Have a good day.